Welcome to Assembly Calendar. I'm Mike Friesen. With us for our program today, Assemblyman Kevin Smardz. Kevin Smardz represents the 146th Assembly District in New York State, an Assembly District that includes Erie County. We want to thank you folks all across Western New York for tuning in for our program today. Assemblyman, nice to see you.
Great to see you too.
Let's get caught up on some of the recent activities here at the state capitol. That's our charge, to let the folks back home know what you're up to here. And of course, the legislature is still feeling the effects of getting the state budget done and in place on time.
Absolutely.
Reasonable budget according to most accounts. Do you agree with that?
I absolutely agree. This is the first time, I believe, in decades that it was actually early. But that's our job. I'm amused when members brag about being on time or early, but that's our job, is to get the budget done.
Well, you needed to be here the 20 years before when it was late every year.
Right.
And thank you for showing up and fixing things and getting the trains running on time.
But what really matters is what was the budget. And again, cutting a deficit, cutting spending, no new taxes. And that kind of a message is what we haven't seen in New York in decades. And I've always told people in my district, what we're seeing now is actual functional government, meaning we have three branches now actually functioning, working together to work for the taxpayers. And that's how it's supposed to be. Put politics aside, you're going to have to compromise and work together, because in the end, it's about the taxpayers.
Certainly, there's a relationship right now between the executive and the legislative when it comes to the budget, the most important relationship of all that is so far improved.
Sure.
Looking back, you knew when you got here to Albany that this legislature had been known over the past decade or two or three as a free spending legislature.
Right.
If there was a program out there, this legislature wanted to fund it. That's had to change the last couple of years.
Well, it's the reality. If you're running your household and you have an income coming in and you know your expenses and you know your savings account, you live within those means. And if there's an emergency, you obviously have a savings account to do that. Well, government has, over the years, maxed out the credit cards, taken the checking account and maxed it out, and there was nothing left. And so what was the option? Let's tax again, let's tax again. And the hardworking families of the state couldn't do it anymore, and the businesses couldn't do it. And we've seen people leave the state. We've seen businesses leave the state. And so if nothing changed last year and this year, I believe we would be seeing another demise of business and people leaving the state.
So there's been a little bit of a change in attitude here amongst the legislature and the governor, and a lot of that spending and taxing has been reined in. Not completely, though.
I understand.
And in fact, you offered up on the assembly floor as the budget was passing an amendment to this budget, a change that would have meant, I guess, more of an institutionalized idea in regards to some tax cuts.
Right, correct. What we have now is in December, the legislature came back and passed the lowest rates for middle-class income taxes in the state in, I believe, 58 years. I offered this amendment in the budget process, which would have made those tax cuts permanent for the families of the state. And I think that's what we should be doing, is if we're going to cut taxes, let's keep them, as opposed to having a sunset where they're going to bring them back up.
Let's take a look at you offering up that amendment on the floor of the State Assembly. Then we'll be back and talk more today with Assemblyman Kevin Smardz.
Thank you. I offer the following amendment. Waive its reading, move it to immediate adoption, and request the opportunity to briefly explain it. This amendment, which incorporates the provisions of Assembly 9404, adds to the bill in chief to continue the 2011 middle-class tax cut beyond 2015 by reducing the marginal personal income tax rates on middle income taxpayers from 6.85 to 6.45 and 6.65. Last December, we were here. We enacted the new tax rates, and it's a temporary personal tax income rate of 8.82 for higher income, and we reduced the tax rate for middle-class income taxpayers. But on January 1st, 2015, the new tax rates and brackets will expire, and they will revert back to the tax rates and tax brackets that were effective in 2008, thus increasing taxes on the middle-class families of the state of New York. Today, we have that opportunity to stop that and continue those tax cuts for our middle-class, hardworking families. And tax relief must be provided to the struggling middle class in New York State. And through this today, we will be able to continue that beyond 2015. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
A good attempt, and I think a lot of people would appreciate it, but the hard reality of the fact is that those sorts of amendments, when offered up, sometimes serve best as an idea starter, getting the majorities and the governor. I mean, that budget was pretty much set when you offered that thing up, that amendment up.
Correct.
But maybe that'll be part of the discussion now.
Well, I think if you look at what's happened last year and this year in the two budgets, and the agenda that was pushed through really came from the Assembly minority agenda for the past 10 years. It was those ideas that were put out there 5, 6, 8, 10 years ago that actually were enacted in the past two budgets. And I think that's a great testament of what we're doing in our conference.
We are also seeing now across New York State school budgets coming up for votes, along with school board members and other things that are happening at schools. Lots of votes, lots of things coming up in just the middle of the month of May. What we are seeing, Assemblyman, as the school districts are preparing for those votes, is a fair amount of angst, some consternation with state government.
Sure.
Because it was a year or two ago that the state put a restriction on local government, school districts, towns, villages, counties, that they could only increase tax revenues with the property tax by 2% a year.
Correct.
They're going to say to you and your colleagues, anybody who'll listen to them, that, you know what, the costs are going up more than 2%. In fact, some of the costs that are mandated upon us by the state legislature itself go up more than 2% a year, but you've kind of tied our hands as to how much we can increase things. Has there been any change? Was that part of this budget, or is that something now that the legislature needs to deal with before it is done with this session in a few weeks?
Well, when the tax cap was enacted, mandate relief was promised. The governor promised mandate relief, and I think everybody was looking forward to that when that happened. We had one of the recent polls when the tax cap was enacted. There was roughly 79% of taxpayers said, we want this cap. They were fed up with the tax and spend policies of school districts and local governments. But without mandate relief, the tax cap's not going to work. And I have a yearly meeting with my school superintendents, and we're looking at what they're doing locally to keep their costs in. And I have school districts who are bare bones now. They've closed buildings, they've consolidated services, they've unfortunately laid off people. And their reserves are dwindling. They've done everything that they possibly can at the local level to keep the costs down, but the state is not offering true mandate relief. And without the mandate relief, we're not going to see success with the tax cap. I've introduced legislation that would offer real mandate relief. You just can't nibble around the edges. And a lot of times you see that at state government. We'll throw a little bit here, a little bit there, but the true core reforms that we need aren't being offered. Tri-borough amendment. That needs to be repealed. We're the only state in the entire country that has this, that allows for pay increases when there's not a union contract negotiated. So that contract expires, yet the taxpayers are still on the hook for pay increases for these employees, and yet nobody wants to come to the table and negotiate. And I have a hard time when two groups of adults can't come and sit down and say, let's work this out. And especially when the taxpayers are footing the bill. I believe it was in the early 80s, Governor Carey, in his last term, allowed this to come through, and his finance director had said, don't do it, because he foresaw the financial difficulties that were going to happen 20 years, 30 years down the road. And here we are today. WIC's law, we know what that does. I served on a local town board for many years in my community, and we saw the increased cost because of the WICs, and when prevailing wage kicks in, that cost is passed on to the taxpayers, and it's a proven fact it raises the cost. I sat there, I saw the bids come in, I saw when prevailing wage kicked in, it hurts the taxpayers. And I think we need to have a fair playing field when it comes to those kind of projects throughout the state. It shouldn't be leaning one way or the other regarding those projects.
There's a couple of, when I think of mandates, I think of where the state says to school districts, well, you got to have this program, or you got to buy these books, you got to teach the kids this particular curriculum. But you went kind of bigger, and then you could step back and take even a bigger step and say the Medicaid program that the state has in place. Counties have to pay for part of that program. The pension costs. The state arranges what pension costs are for workers, not just at the state level, but also at the local level. And those counties and municipalities and school districts are all bound by those kinds of agreements. And those are huge cost factors now for them.
And looking at Medicaid, in Erie County alone, 95% of the property taxes in Erie County go strictly to pay Medicaid. That means there's nothing left. There's no money left to use for the county services that we need. I've sponsored legislation that would allow counties to opt out of the optional Medicaid services that the state mandates. Right now, we're the only state in the country that mandates every single option that Medicaid has. The federal government, mandates a list, and then there's an optional list. Well, New York says we're going to put all those out there and mandate that all the counties pay for that.
That goes back to that thought I had earlier about how there was never a program that the state didn't want to fund and pay for.
Right, exactly. You know, and looking at the opt-out plan, that would allow counties to choose what options they want to offer their taxpayers. I think that's a smart way to go, because the needs in Erie County may be different than the needs in Chemung County. And if you let the counties choose and let them choose what they need for their taxpayers, I think that's a smart way to go. You know, we had a little bit of mandate relief in Medicaid this year, but it wasn't what I think people were really looking for. Now, that will be savings to the counties. And when those savings come down, you know, I've had people ask me, what's going to happen to my tax bill? And my response is, well, that goes now back to the county government, because if they're saving, say, $200 million a year out of their budget, it's up to them now to pass that savings on to the property taxpayers in the county.
It sounds like that ability for the counties and the localities to opt out of certain parts of the Medicaid program, the certain services that are provided within that program.
Sure.
That sounds like a very smart thing to do, because they're the ones who know not only what services they need,
Sure,
but also how tight their budget is.
Absolutely.
And that they need to make some cuts, some hard decisions need to be made. If Albany's not willing to do it, or doesn't think that it can get it done, at least then you've given that task to somebody who can get it done.
Well, you know, a lot of times Albany tells local governments what to do, what they need to do, you know, but sitting up here in the Capitol, you know, do you really know what Erie County needs, or Ontario, and in these various areas of the state? I don't think so. You know, do you know what the town of Hamburg needs? Not sitting in Albany. It should be coming from the local level up to Albany on what the needs are and how we address those needs. And I've been vocal on that also. I joke with my colleagues. I say that, you know, we sit in these four walls of the chamber during the week. We should take one day, go on a field trip. Go talk to business owners, talk to taxpayers, talk to the single mom who's working 2 jobs to make their ends meet before we pass legislation, and make sure we know what that's going to do to their lives and to their business, because those are the people who are paying the bills.
Especially in a state as diverse as New York. That's one of the things that comes up regularly on the program like this, is that there's a lot of education that goes on between the downstate members, the upstate members. I mean, there are members from the Bronx and Queens that probably have never been to Erie County.
Sure.
Never been to Western New York.
I know one of our members actually put forth an idea that we should actually swap districts for a day or two. And so I would go down to Queens or the Bronx and spend a couple days there and see what their district is like.
Maybe that would be a bit of an eye-opener for you.
I think it would be great. Absolutely. It would be for everybody to really see that New York is so diverse, and the needs of upstate are different than downstate or the southern tier, and vice versa.
A lot of times it seems like it boils down to turf wars here when this legislation comes up for debate.
Sure.
And you almost get that sense of disconnect. Well, how could you not understand that we have lofts in New York City that need to have rent control, subsidy regulation, whatever it might be.
Sure.
But, you know, there are things that out in Western New York that are needed out there, especially in terms of jobs and the economy, that those representatives in New York City just don't have maybe a clue about.
Absolutely. And coming down even to agriculture. You know, our agriculture industry is so important in the state. And I think it's important that all the members understand that. And without the farms, there is no food. And as the population increases in the country, we need this agriculture.
Well, one of the quick quizzes that goes around here at the state capitol is name what is the #1 industry in New York State. And it ranges anywhere from e-tailing to manufacturing. No, it's agriculture is actually the #1 industry. It's not even tourism, with all the things that New York State has to offer. So that's where we are right now, and I want to thank the Assemblyman for joining us. In the meantime, if you folks watching want to know how you can reach your representative in Albany, you can reach Assemblyman Kevin Smardz a few different ways. You can stop by the office in Blaisdell. You can pick up the phone, dial 826-1878, or send an email at the address you see right there at the bottom of the screen. That's SMARDZK, SMARDZK, at assembly.state.ny.us. And as we thank Assemblyman Smardz for joining us today, we thank you folks too. And hope to see you soon for our next edition of Assembly Calendar.